Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidiri. And in a bit, we'll be shifting our focus to, I think a devastating civil war that has been ongoing. And we will be speaking to Dr. Musavengana Chibwana. He's a humanitarian advocacy and policy manager at Save the Children, Eastern and Southern Africa, who'll be joining us to give us a bit more insight on the current ongoing unrest and the civil war that is obviously plagued South Sudan, the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, and how that has obviously affected, I think, the most vulnerable groups being women and children. So, yeah, Dr. Musavengana Chibwana is joining us virtually via StreamYard. Dr. Chibwana, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time and chatting to us.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. And I think, the point of departure for me would be obviously putting into focus this ongoing civil conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid forces. If you could just briefly explain, the root cause of this conflict and a brief profile of the two warring parties, because I think it's one conflict that's not as documented as it needs to be, and people not only on the continent but the world over seem to not know and understand just how devastating the current situation in Sudan is, and how the most vulnerable are being affected.
Yeah, thank you so much. We agree with you that the conflict has not received much attention as it's supposed to, perhaps because there are several other conflicts that are happening globally, such as one in Ukraine and another one in the Gaza that you have just been mentioning. And coming from Save the Children as a humanitarian organization, we are more focused with the humanitarian impacts of the conflict that is happening. But to answer briefly your question, the conflict in Sudan is a symptom of unresolved national cohesion issues at independence, where the country and different ethnic groups never saw each other as one people. And I think as the conflict still goes on, even now, we are finding that in some instances, as the recent UN independent report mentions, that there has been systematic targeting of certain ethnic groups. And this speaks to a lack of cohesion within the country, one. The second thing is around exclusion, structured around the same basis of identity politics. And fundamentally, I think that is where the situation is rising from, where the politics of the day are based on identity, and the development and growth of the country is not shared equally amongst all populations. So there is a lot of inequality that is characterized by identities. And the conflict in Sudan has been ongoing since independence, and there have been more than 40. There have been 46 peace agreements since independence, showing that there's the community and the society of Sudan has been fractured, has not been cohesive to as a nation. So this is fundamentally where the problem is, which is manifesting as a civil conflict right now, based on identity politics.
And I think with a conflict like this, I know that it might sound stupid, but we sometimes forget the people that are being directly affected by it. We focus sometimes on the politics thereof, and the two warring parties that, we forget that there are people on the ground who have to suffer the consequences of the civil unrest. Women and children, particularly, I'm mentioning them because they're the most vulnerable groups, and are mostly affected when you have, wars going on and other civil unrest. how have they been affected by this? How women, particularly as you say, I mean, children, particularly as you're from Save the Children, from the information that you guys have gathered, the impact that this civil war has had on them, not only in recent time, but you mentioned that it has been going on since the independence of Sudan. And, for them specifically, how have they been affected?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. The nature of warfare has evolved over time, and we're now dealing with asymmetrical conflicts where there's a blurring of distinction between civilians and combatants. So you are finding that uh, both parties to the conflict are using aerial indiscriminate bombings and sophisticated weaponry that does not discriminate between civilians and combatants. So as a result, we have had more than 18,800 persons killed in the conflict since April 2023, when the recent hostilities started, and with
Mm,
more than 33,000 people injured. We have had more than 10.7 million persons that have been internally displaced within Sudan. Let me just put displacement for you in context. So it's people who have a livelihood, a form of income that they have, and an ecosystem of existence for children going to school and for parents making a livelihood to make sure that their families live well. When they are internally displaced, these 10.7 million people, it naturally means that their entire ecosystems of existence have been disrupted. Children are no longer able to go to school. Since the conflict started, we have had about 19 million children in Sudan. We have not been able to access education for the last more than 1 year, more than 500 days,
mm,
fundamentally because the parties to the conflict are not able to respect international humanitarian law and make sure that the civilian structures such as education, school facilities, and hospitals are not targeted. This is the
mm,
challenge we are dealing with. We also have a dynamic of more than 2.8 million people who crossed borders to neighboring countries. Sudan shares borders with 7 other countries that are equally dealing with crises of their own. We have Ethiopia, we have Chad there, we have South Sudan, we have Libya, we have Egypt, we have Djibouti on the Eritrea on the other side. So these are the crises that have affected the civilians, especially women and children, as you have rightly mentioned. Not to mention the grave violations that the parties to the conflict have been committing. The recent UN report, fact-finding mission on the conflict in Sudan, has indicated that rape has been systematically been used as a weapon of war. We have also learned that starvation has been used as a weapon of war, where there has been denial of humanitarian access to the populations that are in need of help. You are finding that parties to the conflict either put physical or structural barriers to access the people that are in need of assistance. So these are some of the challenges that the civilians in Sudan are grappling with, and we are responding as Save the Children in mitigating that impact by making sure that there's provision of humanitarian support that is needed both for children and their families in responding to the need.
And you mentioned that there's been civil unrest in Sudan since independence. I think the first Sudanese war documented was in 1955, and ever since then, it has not been peaceful in the region. Why do you think peace talks, like those that were held in Geneva, repeatedly failed? What do you think are the main barriers to the negotiations? Because this is unsustainable. You can't have a country going for so long without any kind of peace, and people just living normal lives. I mean, since 1955, that's a whole lifetime. You have generations and generations over and over again that have never experienced living in peace and in harmony in a country of their birth, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for this question. Perhaps the reason why peace talks have been failing, one of them is a lack of a shared vision of a desired Sudan. Because of the identity politics, I think the current configuration, even of the leaders in their thinking, in their negotiation, is to try to tilt to their ethnic favor. So that lack of a shared Sudanese vision, which is inclusive in nature, of the diversities of peoples that we find in Sudan, if it's not there, certainly you will not find there being compromised to say how can we live together, share the resources that we have, have an inclusive government that involves everyone. That's one of the reasons. The second one is around the lack of incentive for peace, because there is a lot of support that is coming in from other parties outside there, supplying weaponry to the conflict, because Sudan is strategically placed for global trade, for access to East Africa, and by its Port Sudan is by the Red Sea. It's a very important ally to have when you have a government in Sudan that supports your cause. And that way you will be able to gain a lot of leverage, even politically and militarily, when you have alliance with Sudan government of the day in reaching out to the Middle East and dealing with the control of the Red Sea. There are so many variables at play. So we have a number of external players who are supporting either of the parties to the conflict, which is disincentivizing these parties to explore for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, because they are continuously being supplied with the weaponry that they need in the conflict to overcome the other party. So the UN report has indicated that if the international community stops supplying weapons to Sudanese belligerents, there is a likelihood that peace can be achieved in sooner than later. But now we have a number of international partners of either of the parties who are supplying weaponry for their own intended good at the expense of the Sudanese people, unfortunately.
And I know you touched a bit, on this, but I want to touch on the state of education for the children in conflict zones like Sudan. What does it look like, and can in any way can it be rebuilt? I'm saying this because I'm sure you've been listening to me as I've been talking about Gaza,
Yeah.
that almost 500,000 children are going to be missing school because the school is just starting this week, and almost 500,000, that's a whole generation, won't be able to go to school because the facilities have been completely obliterated. And the state of education is almost non-existent. When it comes to Sudan, how does it look like? Is it similar? And is there hope of any kind? To rebuild whatever that's left.
Yeah, let me start with the last one. As long as people live, there is always hope, isn't it?
Mm.
But the situation right now is dire. We're talking of about 19 million children who have not been able to access school, to access
Oh.
education. And teachers fear going to those places where conflict is raging, because they fear also naturally for their lives. Schools are being used as shelters for the internally displaced. Even when we want to open schools, for example, that's where the internally displaced populations, the number that I've given you there of 10.7 million people who are internally displaced, the majority of them are being housed in schools.
Mm.
There's been also the indiscriminate bombings of schools. So some physical infrastructure in some places has been destroyed. There's been also the use of schools for military purposes by parties to the conflicts. So these are the attacks on education that we are talking about, which are affecting the children of Sudan. And is there hope? Certainly there is, but it's first of all comes with a exploration of peace, so that children are able to go to school in a safe environment, because we know that school access to education for children is also a child protection measure, because when
Mm.
they are playing with their fellow counterparts in school, it's a mechanism for dealing with mental health issues, on coping with the crisis and the torrid times that they will be facing during conflict, as they do it together in a classroom. It's also an opportunity to make sure that we monitor whether the children are being used, are being recruited for use by belligerent groups. So a grave violation that has been reported by the UN, that some children are being recruited. It's also an opportunity for us to monitor the on child marriages that are happening and abductions that will be happening. So education is essential as a child protection mechanism, and the 19 million children of Sudan have been deprived of that due to this conflict. And like you mentioned in the introductory, it's a whole lost opportunity right there, because childhood is a window, and when that window has been tampered with, it may be difficult to retrieve, or it will take a whole lot more to retrieve what would have been lost. And that's where we are in this crisis.
No, you're painting a really, really bleak picture. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. But before I let you go, my last question would be on the response of the international community. Has it been effective? Have the mediating conversations being one that, I don't know, spark some kind of hope, or has it stalled? Because I think, with the war or civil unrest that has been going on for such a long time, it gets to a point where no one wants to be involved because it has gotten out of hand. But looking at the international community, the United Nations, but also most importantly, the AU, the African Union, do you think that interventions, are leading us to a point where we can say there should be peace and stability in Sudan in the near future?
Yes, starting with the African Union, we commend the efforts that the heads of states have put in place. They have established a high-level panel on Sudan, which is led by eminent diplomats from the continent, who are seeking to bring the parties to the conflict together, including those civilian uh, structures and civil societies that are available in Sudan, who also have a say to the future and the vision of a peaceful Sudan is supposed to look like. And the African Union has been making a concerted effort in that regard. We also acknowledge the UN Security Council for appointing an envoy as well, and the Human Rights Council for undertaking the fact-finding mission, which is showing us the grave violations that are being committed there, which should remind the parties to the conflict that there shall be accountability for the grave violations that are ongoing there. So all these efforts, I think, and the many international organizations that are working in Sudan, such as ourselves and the neighboring countries, in taking care of the refugees, in making sure that the humanitarian support is provided, and in negotiating for access. For example, recently the Adre border from Chad has been opened to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets into Sudan to avoid famine and situations of starvation. All these efforts give us hope that there is possibly a peaceful resolution to this conflict and a united Sudan that can face tomorrow. I think there is hope, especially with a peaceful resolution to the conflict, and there are many efforts, though sometimes they are fragmented, where you find the African Union is pushing on its end, and you are finding other governments making efforts from their own side. But all of these are seeking to ensure that there is a peaceful Sudan. And we are hoping that the parties to the conflict will see the need to compromise and have peace for the sake of their country.
All right, Dr. Musa Chibwani, thank you so much for giving us your time. Really, really appreciate it. Although the picture that you paint is really bleak, looking at children and women, the most vulnerable in our society, being impacted quite negatively by this war. But I'm sure we'll be chatting with you as more and more unfolds out of Sudan. But we're going to leave it here for now. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Musa Chibwani from Save the Children International, painting a really bleak picture when it comes to the ongoing civil unrest in Sudan, and I think it's one that deserves a lot of attention. I'm seeing a comment here from Zanele Zandi Ndlovu saying this is sad. We need a focus on Sudan. Granted, Palestine is going through a lot, but South Africa needs to be involved more on the continent. And I think I couldn't agree with you more. South Africa does need to be involved, and I think in many ways our government is involved, but certainly more can be done. I think with Palestine is the documentation of Palestine has been one that is, taken the world media by storm, and I think that's why the focus will always seem like we are more focused on Palestine than we are on the continent. But I can tell you for sure, the South African government is quite involved in the war in Sudan, and I think I just heard right now that Sudan has actually been suspended from the African Union. So I think that's one other positive that you can take out from the continent's watchdog block, whatever you want to call it, who I think in most part has been quite toothless. But I think from what I'm hearing from Dr. Chibwana is that they need to be commended, as they've been quite hands-on when it comes to this conflict. We're going to take a quick break. Going to come back. News and Views continues.